Hello, our guest today is filmmaker Andrew Goldberg, who is the writer, director, and producer of a new PBS documentary, Armenia, My Home. Welcome.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Yes. First of all, congratulations on the film. It is absolutely beautiful. It is entertaining. It is informative. It is large in a sense, the scope of history and topics that it covers. But somehow at the same time, it's also deeply personal, intimate, and then I should say very emotional. I want to begin our conversation by asking you about the genesis of this film. How did this idea came about, and why did you decide to make it?
Well, I've done films about the Armenians in the past. I don't know if you know that about me. I made a film about the Armenian genocide in 2006 for PBS, and it was a success by how you measure such things. But it was a sad story. I think a lot of Armenian stories have a lot of struggle and heartbreak in them because it's got there's a lot of violence in that in the Armenian history, and we wanted to do a story that was a celebration. How could we celebrate things? And I thought, I was in Armenia in 2000 and the country has come so far. What if we were to do a story that was talking about, what an amazing place Armenia was? So, PBS had made some shows in the past called the Visions shows. There was Visions of Italy, Visions of Greece, where they would fly over these countries with a glider or a helicopter. But we wanted to elevate that and, with all the modern technology and camera work, and then add a real emotional element to it. And so that's how we came up with Armenia, My Home. And the name originally wasn't Armenia, My Home, but that's what people kept saying during the interviews was I got off the plane and I felt like I was at home. And I thought, okay, well, that works. So that's
yeah, it's actually a great title. And I am definitely I have a couple of questions for you regarding the cinematography and look of it, because it just looks absolutely stunning. But before we get to it, throughout the film, you interview members of the Armenian diaspora, of the Armenian community. And as I was watching, I realized that you were able to get incredibly sincere, engaging, and open interviews out of people. And usually, the credit always goes to the director for such performance. Can you talk a little bit about how did you work with people who you interviewed?
Well, I think a lot of that has to do with who we picked. I mean, I picked people for whom being Armenian and being expressive was part of who they were. There's a very good reason that if you just take 5 people randomly. Peter Balakian is a poet. Mm-hmm. Michael Aram creates artistic items and things that express who he is as a person and who he is as an Armenian. Don McKean is a writer. Dadi Ben-Goyan is a storyteller. Father Mesrop gives sermons. These are all people who take what it means to be Armenian, and they've made a life, whether it's their passion or their love or their career, out of converting these ideas about their Armenian identity into expressing it for the greater public. And so there's a very good reason that we chose, the people that we did, and that we didn't choose a lot of other people. A lot of other people have wonderful things to say, and they have wonderful stories, but I wanted a way to tie a narrative together that was going to have a sense of overall poetry to it and overall passion and feeling. Every single person in that film has a kind of professional Armenian side to themselves. And so that's what Yeraz Merkarian is a singer, right? So think about all these different people who express it, whether it's professionally or emotionally or with words. And that's how we put them all together. And they were people who we believed would open up to us. You find, Vahe Berberian's a comedian, and Araxia Karapetyan is a newscaster. Every one of these people is a professional. Take Armenianness and bring it to the world. Sonam Obsesyan is Conan O'Brien's assistant, and her job was to sit next to him all the time and talk about how she's an Armenian. And she ultimately dragged Conan all the way to Armenia. That's another show that I didn't make, but so that's kind of how I think I want to take some credit, because I think I am good at getting people to open up and to share. And to be honest, I think I know what the questions are. I know what the story is, but it helps to have a good cast.
Yeah. And it's an interesting point that you brought up, because it is indeed, there are clergy members, there are journalists, there are actors, there are writers, there are educators, there are musicians. You really have a full kind of a spectrum of diaspora speaking in a single voice, and I think it works really wonderfully. You're also the writer of this film, of course. when I was watching it, the film moves so seamlessly, so kind of organically. But I know behind it there's a tremendous amount of research and labor to make it feel that way. Can you talk a little bit about the writing process? How do you put something like this together on a page?
It's funny. I've written documentary scripts where I rewrote them hundreds of times. This really was a story that told itself. We knew that we didn't want to have it heavy with history, so we didn't have to worry too much about the politics of it all. We really knew that we wanted it to be a series of personal vignettes and stories, and so the narration became a way to simply tie things together, or to give a sort of a skeleton on which to hang everything. But the story it wasn't hard to write. I think I'm 55 years old, so it's a little easier than my first documentary. I remember I made a film called The Armenians, The Story of Survival back in 2000, and I would get on the phone with my historical advisors, and I would just lament over, did Armenia really become Christian in 301? Because according to this archaeological study, it was 303. Well, do we want to mention that? And I would call Ron Suni at night, like, Ron, I just read a thing that it was 314. Professor so-and-so from 1902 in Russia found a rock, and I'm like, going crazy. This wasn't that kind of a story, so I think it made it a little bit easier. And I think I think there was a guiding hand from above that was helping us to tell the story. But of course, I can't prove that, but you never know.
All films have a guiding hand from above. That's just how this profession works. This next question actually was not part of my list that I made ahead of time, but now listening to you, how did you discover Armenia? How did Armenia come into your life?
Armenia comes into people's lives when they're ready for it. You must be the right person at the right time to be introduced to Armenia. Only a few are deserving of Armenia. No, what happened was in 1988, I was a student in college in Chicago, and I was studying a course on the Holocaust. And the professor talked about, did we know that the big giant massacre that happened to the Jewish people was not the first of its kind? There was actually something that was being called at the time the forgotten genocide. Forgotten genocide. And I looked it up. It was in our Encyclopedia Britannica. I would love to get a copy of that original article. And in fact, I think that encyclopedia is still at my late father's house. And it said that the Armenian people had been, a million of them had been killed, and whoever had survived had been marched into the desert to starve to death. And I wrote a paper about it. And so years later, in 1999, so what would have been more than 10 years later, I went to interview at PBS New York, and he said, we have only one job available right now, and it's to make a film about the Armenians. Do you know anything about the Armenians? And I had never made a film. I was really underqualified. And I said, well, let me tell you about the Armenians. I said, they are the first Christians, and they are this. And he was like, I can't believe you know all that stuff. I haven't found anybody who knows anything about them. You're hired. So they hired me to make the film. And what happened was they decided they were going to pledge it, where they ask for money. PBS does that. I don't do that. That's the PBS thing. And because they had pledged the Greek Americans, and the Greek Americans had made a lot of money, and the Italian Americans had made a lot of money. And I said, and Louise Simone saw the Greek Americans. For those of you who don't know who Louise Simone is, she's passed away, but she was a very wealthy philanthropist. Her father was Alex Manoogian. And Louise called the PBS station and said, I want to make one like the Greek Americans, the Armenian Americans. And that's how the show got why it existed to begin with. So they decided to pledge it. And the guy at the PBS station says, this isn't going to make any money. It's a very small community. And I said, okay. But little did he know that every Armenian called every other Armenian, and they all had these watch parties in 1999. And it pledged the highest record. It set the pledge for the most money ever raised in the history of the station. It made $155,000 in one night. And that was more than Italian Americans, Jewish Americans, Greek Americans, Puerto Rican Americans, Chinese Americans, Polish Americans, German Americans. Nobody even came close. The next closest one was Italians. It was like 125. It destroyed it. And they were like, wait a minute, there's only 17 Armenians. How did they do it? Because they were pledging 5-10 videos at a time. They were all buying them for their friends. And suddenly I became like my stock went up. But people at PBS were like, "Who is this guy who made this show?" That no. That's how I got.
We are small, but we are mighty.
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
um, you you filmed some of the most iconic landmarks in Armenia.
Greatest.
You Gegard Monastery, Tatev Monastery, Echmiadzin, of course, Genocide Memorial,
Yeah.
beautiful shots of Yerevan, not to mention absolutely breathtakingly spectacular countryside and the nature that Armenia offers. Can you talk a little bit about how you chose the location and how was it like to film these places?
Well, we shot several hours a day for like 20 days. So that's something like, let's say we have like maybe 50 or 60 hours of just of drone footage. And the film probably is an hour long. It probably has like interviews and it has archive materials. Maybe it has 35 minutes of drone footage. So if you figure we have 50 hours and we only used about a half an hour, we have 100-to-1 shooting ratio. So there's an enormous amount of material that is not in the show. And I was saying somebody should license that from us and start making commercials for go to visit Armenia. But that's another story. But I worked with so basically, the first thing I did just to find the greatest hits was I went on an Armenian tourist website and I started listening to Facebook page and I started looking for where everybody went and what they said. And one guy made a list of the best places and someone else made comments and someone else made comments. And so I started taking all these things because I know Armenia a lot, but I don't know every little place. I didn't know Chermik Waterfall. I'd heard of it, but that's my favorite shot in the whole movie, by the way, because the drone comes all the way down the mountain, down the Chermik Waterfall.
Beautiful.
And so we took this list, and then I sent the list to a couple of people in the United States. And I said, what do you think of this list? They said, oh, you need to add this, you need to add this, you need to add this. Everybody wants to add, And then I sent it to the tourism board in Armenia. And I said, listen, what do you think are the best places that we should add to this list? What's special, what's important? And they gave me their lists. It just kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And ultimately we had to cut it down because it was too big. And so, but we shot a lot of places, that we didn't use. But there's a lot of Armenia we never got to. I mean, I would love to get to the southern border. I'd love to get up to the northern border. I mean, we didn't get to a lot of those places. It's neat to look over. I remember like years ago, I hired someone in Iran to shoot Nakhichevan from Iran because I wanted to get there used to be a cemetery there that the Azeris destroyed, and I have footage of it somewhere. I don't know where, but because we couldn't get into Nakhichevan safely. So there are neat border shots that you can get that we didn't get. I wanted to try and shoot Ani from the Armenian side. We didn't get to shoot that, but there's a lot of, and you can't get a drone up there, by the way. It'll get shot down by the Armenian army, but.
Yeah. So I just want to stay on that topic a little bit longer. The film, as I said earlier in our conversation, looks absolutely stunning. Can you talk a little bit about cinematography of this film? There's a lot of obviously drone footage. There's a lot of aerial shots. But what struck me as very interesting that some of these landmarks that are very familiar to us, Armenians particularly, were shot from very interesting angles and gave completely new perspective of how we should see them or perceive them.
Look, I mean, I think there's an assumption that you shooting a drone means you just fly your drone up. I mean, someone said to me, why'd you spend so much money on your drone cameraman, cameraman? My friend, Bob or Steve is really good at shooting a drone. Trust me, he's just as good. And I was like, no, he's not. Mm-hmm. I hired these guys out of Australia who work on, like they did Thor, Love and Thunder. They were the camera drone ops for that. They're the drone operators for the upcoming Mad Max. Mm-hmm. Furiosa. And what I liked about them is that they didn't have an American eye. I mean, an Australian eye is similar to an American eye, but it's different. I mean, if you get into other countries and people have different ways that they look at things. We're very used to American cinematographers and how they frame things and how they look at things. It's why foreign films look different, because they shoot things differently, and so they're Australian, so it's a little bit different. Just the day-to-day, the culture of how films are made over there, the conversations are different. And then they'd had a lot of work on, big Hollywood movies. And so I really liked their look. And there's probably, maybe a dozen guys that shoot at that level of Hollywood and car commercials and all the really top stuff. but then who also do it in a way that I liked. It's like we talked to some very fancy, expensive people, and I didn't like the way their stuff looked, or I didn't like their personalities. We wanted someone who could gel with our team.
Sure.
And then we had a ground guy that I've shot with for years, and he's an Emmy-winning, cinematographer. He's super dependable, and then the other part of it is just the technology. I mean, we didn't have this technology. You couldn't the drones that we have. So that's called the drone that we use is called the Inspire 3. It's the most versatile film drone really out there right now, and it shoots 8K. We've heard of like HD is like this much, and then 4K is 4 times as much as HD. So a lot of TVs right now are 4K. So ours is 8K. So it's 4 times as much as 8K as 4K is. It's 16 times your high definition television, the resolution, 16 times. And so we had an 8K Cinema DNG Inspire 3 drone being shot by the best drone photographers there are, and it had been released. The company that makes it, DJI, released it 2 days before we got on the airplane. So it was the newest, most sophisticated, still is. I mean, it's only 6 months ago, the most sophisticated drone available that we shot Armenia with. I mean, it's certainly probably the first documentary ever that was shot with that. And then for the ground camera, we also had 8K. We used a camera by Red, a company called Red. It's called the Red V Raptor, with really nice lenses, cinema lenses of all different shapes and sizes. And, we had all sorts of clever ways to make shots, look like they're flowing or changing frame rates, or, handheld with what's called a gimbal, all these different little neat things to make it pretty. Like, we wanted to shoot in the vernissage. Well, my cameraman had just watched a film about how Stanley Kubrick, the filmmaker, used to do these moving shots. He would sit in a wheelchair. So we rented a wheelchair, and my cameraman is sitting there with this huge camera. I have a photo of it somewhere. And we're pushing him through with a wheelchair. Everyone's looking at him like, why is this man in a wheelchair with a giant camera? It was very funny, but it got a great shot. You see, it's only 1 second, but it was a fun shot. I think we had more fun making the shot than actually caring about using it.
I want to change the topic and talk about the recent. I know you said that you wanted to make something uplifting, but I'm sure during the filming or while you were preparing to film, Armenia suffered one of its worst tragedies, perhaps since genocide, which was loss of Artsakh. Why do you think it was important to include Artsakh in a film, and what would you like your especially non-Armenian viewers to know about this conflict?
Look, I mean, you couldn't not include it. I mean, I remember having a conversation with PBS about it. I mean, we wanted this film to be a celebration, not a downer. But first of all, you got to have heartbreak in an Armenian documentary. That's what makes this like Jewish. It's like the same thing. We have a prayer, a Jewish prayer. It's a joke. They tried to kill us. They didn't. Let's eat. And, you could say the same thing about the Armenian story. They tried to get rid of all the Armenians. They failed. They got rid of too many of them, unfortunately, but the Armenians survived and succeeded and thrived and did well, which is really the ultimate insult to the Turks who tried to get rid of them.
Sure.
But how could we not include it? I mean, it was horrible. It was just horrible. And you got to have compassion for anybody who's suffering, no matter who they are or what their ethnic group is. Suffering, especially the innocent, the kids and the older people, or whatever. But I mean, this was just a human rights disaster, and it was horrifying, and it's still horrifying. I mean, Armenia is not equipped to take 100,000 plus people in. It doesn't have the resources, the housing, the food.
In a span of 72 hours. So.
Yeah. I don't know who has that. Could probably bring some of them here. I don't know that many are here. I mean, I think that and I don't know that Armenia's I mean, even has that kind of has even like would know how to do that. I mean, America is a country of immigrants, right? We kind of know what to do when people get here. We've got systems in place. Armenia doesn't have anything like that. Nobody moves there. There's not like this mass immigration to Armenia. It never has been, So, if anything, a lot of people have moved out. So, it's going to be a real learning curve for Armenia. And I hope that the philanthropic community, ponies up in a big way, because that's what is needed right now, is like several $1 billion. And people need to, to recognize that, that's their responsibility, and I did my part. You don't make a lot of money making PBS documentaries, but our part was to try and bring this to the viewers. And so when you ask me, what do I want non-Armenians to know, is to know that this human rights catastrophe is happening and happened, and is the direct result of the fact that Azerbaijan felt they needed all of the land for themselves, and that there was no negotiation and that they should kill a lot of people in the process. So, it's pretty sad and heartbreaking.
Yeah. You also produced the film, and I know that producing involves dealing with lots of people, specifically in Armenia. I'm sure you dealt with, obviously your crew, the local crew, organizers, municipality, official people, drivers, and local population, maybe in some of the urban areas and rural areas as well. What do you think of Armenian people? Give us some story about the behind the scene production story of working with people in Armenia.
It depends, because our driver drove me crazy. Eric Bogosian is in the bonus footage. He's not in the DVD. He's not in the movie itself, but in the DVD, Eric Bogosian says that he was told to always be careful to cross at the right crosswalk because some of the Armenian drivers will try to run you over. Our driver was a disaster, and I was yelling at him every day. I think he thought I was a loony bin. He couldn't understand why I did not want him passing people at 90 miles an hour in a 16-passenger van on the wrong side of the street while going up a mountain facing a hill that you can't see over. And I can't tell you the number of times I just, freaked out, worried that we were going to shoot off a cliff or get, slammed into by some guy in a Lada, and so, there was that. I mean, I can't make a story about Armenian people. I mean, they're people. They're just people. I mean, everybody's their own personality. It's funny though. Vahe Berberian says in the film that when he first went to Armenia, nobody on the street would smile at him. He would walk down the street smiling, and because they had that leftover Soviet, the Soviet thing that you didn't smile. It wasn't a big smiling country. I went to Russia. I went to Russia in '95, and nobody smiled at me. It's different now. Now you go to Armenia and you have kids. So think about it, right? Armenia is free in '91. It's 2024. So it's been 33 years. So unless you were like at least 20 years old, so unless you're if you're under 50, the majority of your life has been outside of communism. And so those people smile. So now you go to Armenia and you see a lot of smiles. You didn't used to see that.
That's wonderful.
So, that would be that. I would say the government was pretty good. The municipality was not that hard to work with. They were nice to us at the airport. There was some bureaucracy. It was a little ridiculous. They still like to have forms and stamp things, which is a little leftover Soviet. It's time to stop that. Let's move on, folks. But I think the country's grown up a lot, and it's neat. It's neat to see that. I don't know that Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan and Azerbaijan and Tajikistan can all claim the same combination of freedom, enthusiasm, and growth that Armenia can.
It's actually
made money with oil. I don't know. You don't go to the store and suddenly there's all these Azerbaijani products for sale. It's interesting. The Kazakhstan has had a I'm talking about former Soviet republics. Kazakhstan had a public relations campaign, which was Kazakhstan, it's very nice, which is a playoff of Borat. When Borat went there, very nice, or however he says it. And I think that Armenia is certainly the best looking country, and they should have a PR. They should do some PR and market for tourism, because tourism is so good. When you go to Armenia, even if you just sleep in a tent, you're spending your money on bread. You're taking trains, you're pumping into the economy. Then you come back to America, you're a commercial.
That's right.
So what I'd like to see is more tourism, real aggressive expenditures on tourism.
Okay, and my final question in the last 4 or so minutes we have left. It will not be an overstatement to say that Armenia is under existential threat today. And what makes, I think, your film even more important, because people can see what a jewel it is, what an important place it is that requires attention and requires protection. What do you want the audience to take away from this film after they watch it?
Well, you're raising two different issues. Armenia under existential threat is a conversation that can be had, and it certainly faces a very scary potential future, when it comes to Azerbaijan and Turkey. I don't anticipate Turkey invading Armenia anytime soon, but I think Azerbaijan could certainly make a play for certainly a southern strip to get it to Nakhchivan. And I think that Iran has said they don't want that, and I think that that's because Iran does not want an ally of Turkey to block its entire northern border. When Iran is your safety net, things are really going to they certainly raise my eyebrows. I mean, I don't think Iran is a dependable player, and I don't think Iran has the economic, financial, or military wherewithal to be a country that you want to put any eggs in that basket, so to speak, especially given how it's viewed around the world. And so in that regard, Armenia, I think, is in a precarious situation because Russia is no longer really doing much of anything. I mean, I suppose they do things from time to time, and Georgia is powerless. And I don't know that Georgia has any lost love for Armenia anyway. So Armenia is really in a bad neighborhood, right? I think it's important that Armenia, in the geopolitical conversation, it really looks more to the West, looks more to Europe, and looks more to the United States. Even if it doesn't work, I think it needs to try. And I think that I don't see any downside to that. I think that lands on the shoulders of the diaspora. And I say this because I look at the fact that Israel has the United States, and that's a long developed relationship that was done in large part by, an active campaign by American Jews. American Jews who let's not get into whether or not you like Israel or whether or not the politics of it are appropriate. All I'm talking about is let's just talk strategy. Just talking strategy. Israel has no allies in that region, none. I think that there's something to be learned there. Taiwan, again, another example of a country, Taiwan, scary China staring it down. Taiwan leans into its relationship with the United States. The United States will respond, but that takes aggressive lobbying. And so, my takeaway for people of my film is not a political one. My takeaway is get in an airplane and go there, have some pilaf and say, hey, pass the lamb. That's what I want. But you asked me another question about an existential threat. And when I think about the fact that I see a lot of missteps being taken, listen, what do I know? I mean, I'm an American. I don't live there. I don't know what it's like every day. I'm not on the border. I'm not talking to those other leaders. So for me to actually give advice to Armenia is pretty egotistical. I'm not doing that in any formal way. I'm just saying I'm looking at the patterns and what has worked in the past with countries like Taiwan, with countries with a place like Hong Kong, and ultimately I don't know that worked. But let's say Taiwan and with Israel, and they lean hard into American to try and make an ally. And I think at least that's worth a bigger effort than we're seeing right now. And that's going to come from a will by the diaspora to put resources against it.
Yeah, I think your assessment is actually spot on. Andrew Goldberg, writer, director, producer of a new PBS documentary, Armenia, My Home. Thank you so much for your time. And for our viewers, if you haven't seen the film, it's being streamed across the nation on PBS stations. To make sure we will put in information how to find it and how to watch it. Definitely tune in and watch the film. It is absolutely beautiful, beautiful project. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Armenia, a small country of nearly 3 million people located north of Iran and south of Georgia. Its history goes back millennia. Armenia was the first nation to adopt Christianity as the official state religion in the early 4th century. The Armenians had their own language and rich cultural and intellectual traditions. In the 1500s, the Armenians were absorbed into the Islamic Ottoman Empire, where they lived under a system that allowed them to live side by side with the Ottomans, but often relegated them to a lower status. In the early 20th century, the Ottomans turned on the Armenians and committed genocide, slaughtering as many as 1.5 million Armenians in the most violent ways imaginable. To this day, the Ottoman successor, the Turkish government, denies the genocide ever happened. Ultimately, a small part of the historic Armenian homeland was absorbed into the Soviet Union, where Armenians lived under communist rule. This land became free in 1991. This is the land that today we call Armenia.